All right. As Sandra had mentioned, Steve can't be with us today, so I'll be presenting on both of our behalf from the Australian Data Archive, assessing the Australian Data Archive as a trusted digital repository. So the presentation today will give a background of what is the Australian Data Archive, or the ADA, and what is the Data Seal of Approval, the DSA, and the WDS, how it's combined with the World Data Service, the processes and outcomes of this Data Seal of Approval, and then assessing this seal in the Australian context. And in true Canberra style, I'm going to use a lot of acronyms and hopefully remember to tell you what all of those acronyms are. So I'll give you a brief history of the Australian Data Archive. We were started in 1981 and housed at the Research School of Social Sciences at the Australian National University, with a brief to provide a national service for the collection and preservation of computer-readable data relating to social, political, and economic affairs, and to make these data available for further analysis. Our mission hasn't changed much over the years. We still take any kind of readable data and try to make it available to other researchers. Our archive currently holds over 5,000 data sets from over 1,500 studies, including national election studies, public opinion polls, social attitudes and surveys, censuses, not quite the 2016 census yet, but as soon as it is released, we'll be holding it, the aggregate statistics and administrative data, and many other sources of data. Our data holdings are sourced from academics, from government agencies, and from non-government sectors and private sectors. This is just a brief sampling of what the Data Archive holds, and we curate this data into 7 sub-archives of social science, historical, indigenous, longitudinal, qualitative, crime and justice, and international studies. The ADA has a very broad remit, as you can see, to take anything of a national interest or high impact interest, anything that's covered by our sub-archives, or anything that our director, Steve, decides is important enough to put into the archive. So currently, we've moved around the university as the way for most archives, and we're currently in the Center for Social Research and Methods, still at the ANU. This center has a very strong data, methods, and research focus, which fits well with the Australian Data Archive because we can provide that data to these people for teaching and research purposes. We still are a broad-based social science research data with research data, government data, private and NGO data. We are also serviced by the National Computational Infrastructure, or the NCI, which is the largest supercomputer in the Southern Hemisphere, which happens to be housed at the ANU, which has been advantageous for us because we can leverage the ANU's access to it for our storage and computational facilities. So now I'm going to go into a bit about what is the Data Seal of Approval. So trustworthiness of archives is becoming a very large player in the discussions that governments and archives are having, especially with this open data push and the open access pushes. Currently, the European Framework of Audit and Certification, or EFAC, has 3 levels of certification, with this Data Seal of Approval, which I'll be talking about, being the base standard, and the ISO standard being the highest level, which is a financial input and a very time-intensive input. So the Data Seal of Approval was originally the standard set for the social sciences by the Data Archiving and Networked Service of DANS. There was also another service, which was the International Council for Science and World Data Systems, the ICSU-WDS, or we just call it WDS. And in the recent years, the DSA, or Data Seal of Approval, and the WDS decided to merge during the Research Data Alliance and set one base level of certification for base Data Seal of Approval. So the Australian Data Archive was given some money by ANS, which is Australian National Data Service, which has a remit to help make Australian research data assets more valuable for the research community. They gave us some money to figure out what is a trusted repository and how to get access to a trusted repository, or to get a certification for a trusted repository, and how does that relate to the Australian context? So initially we looked at just doing the data seal of approval, but then we found out we were going to do the 2014-2017 standards for the data seal of approval. And we found out that they were combining their standards in September, November that year. So we decided to wait and do the joint data seal of approval WDS standard. So we had to put off our application until after November. So we didn't actually put in our standard until March, and we were using the new joint standards, so 16 guidelines for a data seal of approval. We put it in April. We were due to have a review back by May, and as of yet, we still don't have a review. So we can't actually say that we are a trusted digital repository, unfortunately, which is what we'd hoped to be able to say when we came to the presentation. We did use the new criteria, which were originally released in A form in November, and not into a pretty form until January, February. So what is entailed in the data seal of approval WDS process? Well, first of all, we looked at what was the DSA previously. There was an iteration in 2010, which changed in 2014, 2017, but it pretty much had the same guidelines, just some minor wording changes. But when it changed from the 2014 to 2017 standards from the data seal of approval to this joint seal of approval for the 2017-2019 standards, it enlarged its focus and breadth dramatically. It was no longer a direct one-to-one matching from the data seal of approval by DANS to a guideline. Now, one of the old guidelines could actually entail up to 5 of the new guidelines or none of the new guidelines. We found that 2 of the new guidelines never existed in the data seal of approval for the social sciences previously. These were organizational structure and expert guidance. So currently there were no other organizations that had ever undertaken the DSA WDS, so we had no one to base our information upon. Whereas when you previously undertook the data seal of approval, you could look at all of the past people who had applied for the data seal approval and learn and stand on the shoulders of giants to make your own application. So we found that this new data seal of approval has a very strong emphasis on more general and more specific items. There was much more of an IT, security, IT preservation, and a risk management emphasis. There was also a governance, expert guidance, and business plans and budgets that they wanted to know everything about your organization. There was also a data quality assurance, so they wanted to know how we assessed the researchers' data, how we made sure that it was complete, how we made sure that it was trusted, how we made sure that it was quality data. There's also areas that you could outsource, but you had to explain what you were outsourcing and why. So that's the basis of the standards. Here is an example of one of the new standards. This is guideline number 5, organizational infrastructure. So it says the actual guideline is, the repository has adequate funding and sufficient numbers of qualified staff managed through a clear system of governance to effectively carry out the mission. The star rating, they used to give you a base number of stars that you would have to assess by. Now you have to rate yourself on the number of stars. 1 is still not applicable for our repository, and 4 is fully implemented for our repository. But then you'll notice that they give you some guidance in these form of 4 bullet points. These guidance items we found didn't always necessarily directly reflect the actual guideline. So we found it difficult to figure out if we were supposed to be answering the guidance or the guideline. We went with answering the guidance. So one of the challenges that we found during this process was, what were the minimum requirements? Previously, the data seal of approval told you how many star ratings you had to have at a minimum. The new rating system does not tell you what a minimum requirement is. We assume it's a minimum of 1, but we're not actually sure. We also weren't able to ascertain if you needed to answer all of the guidelines or all of the guidance in any of the systems. So we answered, to the best of our ability, all of the guidance in each of the guidelines, but we never found out if this was accurate yet or not. We also found that there was a complex interplay between the relevant documents required for the guidelines. So your IT policy may actually fulfill more than one guideline, or it might only fulfill one guideline, and figuring out how to restate the information without directly restating the exact same information, just saying, read my IT policy. It's not appropriate. You have to specify which part of your IT policy in each one of the guidelines. We also had a difficulty trying to figure out, most of the items are supposed to be in the public domain, but many of our items are not in the public domain as of yet. We've used this process to figure out which one of those does need to be in the public domain, but we have a very extensive wiki at the Australian Data Archive, and trying to figure out how to recognize that we have this information, it's just not in the public domain. How do we give this information to the reviewer to review the data archive, or how do we move it to the public domain in the necessary timeline? Previously, there was only one reviewer required from the Data Seal of Approval. Now that it is a joint commission, there is one reviewer from the Data Seal of Approval, one from the World Data Service, and then it has to go to the board. So it's now a 2-reviewer and a board review process before you get feedback of if you've got a seal or if you can even reply to their comments. So we have seen one reviewer's comments, but I don't know if that we were supposed to see those reviewer comments as of yet. But they had indicated that one of our things that we said we were in the process of implementing, we needed to state timelines and outcomes, but there was never any guidance in the guidelines or in the guidance that states if you say it's in process, you need to specify a specific timeline. So we found that to be a bit of a grievance. So what did we actually do for the Data Seal of Approval? It's a self-assessment process, so you get access to the 16 guidelines, and as your repository, you go through and write up an assessment against each one of those guidelines and submit it to the DSA. So we self-assessed that we were at a level 3, which is in progress or in the implementation phase for 4 of the guidelines out of the 16. These were Guideline 7, Data Integration and Authenticity, Guideline 10, Preservation Planning, as our preservation plan is not fully in the public domain. Guideline 15, the Technical Infrastructure, because a lot of our infrastructure is actually outsourced because we're part of a university. We don't hold control over a lot of that infrastructure, so answering some of the questions that they had, we couldn't do, so we put it at a level 3. Number 16 is security, and it was the same kind of interplay. Being a part of a large university, we don't have a lot of control over some aspects of our security. We did assess ourselves at 12 of the guidelines to a level 4, which is the highest, implemented. The guideline has been fully implemented for the needs of our repository. But the assessor that we did get a little bit of feedback from wanted to actually move one of those from a level 4 to a level 3, and that was guideline number 9, documented storage procedures. So again, our assessment is not yet actually complete. There was a draft from one of the reviewers that we saw briefly, but we haven't seen any information from the second reviewer or the board, even though it was due in May. So let's assess this for the Australian context. So to determine what is the Australian context, we decided to figure out who had actually applied for the Data Seal of Approval from DANS previously. And we only found one institution, and that was Paradisic, which is a language archive and cultural archive. They used the 2010 standards, and they got a data seal of approval back in 2012, which means they're due to reapply for a new data seal of approval now because their data seal has expired. And for the ICSU WDS system, they used to actually have membership. So if you undertook their data seal of approval for other sciences, you would get regular membership. And we found there were two organizations, the Australian Antarctic Data Centre and the WDC Space Weather Australia, had both undertaken the seal from the WDS previously. It's unclear if they need to reapply for the new seal or if their regular membership will carry them into the future. And it's also unclear, and we have yet to get any feedback from the board when we have emailed, if completion of the new data seal actually gives you membership in WDS, or if you need to apply separately for membership in the WDS. So it's still unclear and up in the air. So we used ANDS and the Research Data Australia portal to discover how many organizations counted themselves as having a repository or archive that could actually potentially benefit from doing a data seal of approval self-assessment. And we found that there were 103 organizations, research organizations. These were mostly institutional repositories, disciplinary repositories or archives, and governmental agencies. So there is definitely a need in Australia. Now, I'd like to note that the findings that we found were not necessarily only Australian-specific challenges, but they're actually a reflection of the broad diversity of the repository sector, but they definitely do play an important role in Australia. So some of these Australian considerations and contexts that we have found while doing the data seal approval was the complexity of institutions and repositories. One institution does not equal one repository in Australia. One institution may hold a plethora of repositories, or one repository may actually service multiple institutions. So it's not a direct interplay, and it's not necessarily a direct interplay in any other country or European Union in the world. Also, our national frameworks. So these are things like the Productivity Commission reports and other framework reports that govern use of data and sharing of data in Australia are definitely an important aspect. And they can actually differ from state and territories or between universities or institutions. Also, the funding frameworks. The Australian Research Council has its own policies and procedures about access and interplays, which are different or similar to different areas of the world. Also, the infrastructure frameworks, such as the NCI, the supercomputer, is accessible to almost all major institutions in Australia. That's a very unique thing for the Australian context and the National Broadband Network and things of that nature. Also, governance frameworks. Each university has a different governance framework. The ANU is unique in that we are enacted by an act of parliament, so our governance is even slightly different from other universities in Australia. So, what have we found from doing this process? Well, the ADA pretty much was beta testing or being an initial tester for the World Data Service Data Seal of Approval. And we found it to be a very interesting and very worthwhile process. We found that they did engage in a lot of communication with us, and they have actually taken on board many of our questions, which have assisted them in fleshing out their guidelines and guidance, giving them better wording or better detailing of what their guidance needs to entail. What did we find from the data seal of approval? Well, we found that the data seal of approval itself needs to help detail which items need to be in the public domain and which items don't need to be in the public domain, as not all elements we feel need to be made public. Many universities will not make all aspects of their budgetary bottom lines available in the in the public domain. So putting that in your budget and guidance is going to be quite difficult. Also, how do we explain items that are out of our direct control, such as funding, infrastructure, and governance? We only get funded on 3-year, 5-year cycles. So how do we ensure that we are a long-term and lasting repository when we can only say, well, we have funding for 1 year or 3 years? Also, the risk management standards that the Data Seal of Approval wanted to use, they were referencing doing an ISO standard of risk management, but we feel that doing a base standard of the EFAC model, so the European Framework Model, why would we actually pay to do an ISO standard of risk management for a free self-assessment? We're not saying that risk management is not an important aspect. It is definitely an important aspect, and we would like to work with ANZ on developing Australian-specific risk management models that can be given freely and openly to other institutions in Australia for the Australian context of risk management. And during the actual self-assessment, it helped the Australian Data Archive look at itself and realize our webpage definitely needs to be updated. We definitely have aspects that need to be placed into the public domain. We really need to work on some of our policies and procedures in polishing them so that they can be in the public domain and understandable in the public domain. And it's also helped us to realize that potentially we need to update our software provider, currently using Nestar, and we're looking at moving to Dataverse. And with that is going to become even more policy and procedure document changes, which we'll have to be placing in the public domain. We will be providing reports to the Australian National Data Service and other government bodies based on our assessment and feeding that information back to the Data Seal of Approval, which they have graciously accepted that they will love to see what the report says. And in the future, we would like to look further at the other levels of certification, so those being the DIN and the ISO, and finding out how much more levels of trust are afforded with this higher paid, higher levels of certification, and if that makes a difference to our user community. So, thank you. Ended a little bit early. And eventually our entire Data Seal of Approval guidelines, every guideline that we answered, will be available on our website, as will the reports that we do to ANZ.
Thank you, Heather. That was a very challenging presentation to do as the last one before afternoon tea, I think. And Heather gets a gold star for the greatest number of acronyms in a presentation so far.
It's a Canberra thing.
Are there any questions for Heather? Yes.
I have actually two questions. I'm assuming the Data Seal of Approval has a maturity model that it's trying to design so that organisations can work out where it needs to improve, and that is the purpose of it, is it not? Or?
The purpose of the Data Seal of Approval is to award a seal that you can actually put on your website that means that you hold trusted data, or that you can be trusted with people's data, in that you have thought through your procedures, policies that the international standards believe equate to a trusted repository.
Okay. Was in the terms of risk management, is cybersecurity part of that assessment?
Yes. So cybersecurity is both entailed in the IT security, the security, and in the risk management plan. So that's what I was saying. There is a complex interplay of what one policy can and should cover. So cybersecurity is actually covered in all three of those aspects, which are four separate questions in the guidelines. So each time you have to reiterate, this is what we're doing, this is what we're doing, without sounding like a broken record.
Yeah. So I'm assuming that would be very difficult to prove, apart from stating you have particular policies and strategies and infrastructure to guard against data leakage and etc. So how do you get around that in demonstrating that?
That's a very good question, because we currently outsource a lot of our IT to our central IT, so the ANU's IT, and to the National Computational Infrastructure, obviously has its own cybersecurity and IT risk management and infrastructures that they don't necessarily share with us.
Correct.
Because they don't want it publicly known, so it can't be hacked, which is completely understandable, but has made for a very complex situation while we're trying to apply for this, saying we're outsourced, we're trusting them because our university says to trust them pretty much. And we're just saying they're the experts in this area, so therefore we're trusting them, which isn't necessarily the right way of going about it. So we are actually trying to work with them to draft documents of what we can say to the public.
You can't say, trust me, I'm an expert.
Yeah, no, that doesn't really go down too well.
Okay.